It had a nickname, whispered from one crew to the next. They called it the Ronson. It was a grim joke, born from a popular lighter slogan of the time, "Lights up the first time, every time." Climbing into your Sherman tank each morning meant climbing into a machine known for catching fire. And by the autumn of 1944, in the muddy fields of France, every crewman knew it. If you stay with us on this journey, you'll discover how one young man, in a moment of pure desperation, found a way to fight back. Not with thicker armor, but with time itself. Imagine waking before dawn, the air cold and damp. Your first breath tastes of diesel and wet earth. You pull on a uniform that never quite feels dry and walk toward a 30-ton box of steel that is both your fortress and your cage. You and 4 other men are about to spend the next 12, maybe 16 hours inside it. The space is so tight you can't fully stand up. You can't stretch your legs. Every movement is a negotiation with the man next to you. What must it have felt like, knowing the reputation of the machine you called home? The M4 Sherman tank was, by many measures, a triumph of American industry. Over 50,000 of them rolled off assembly lines, a seemingly endless river of steel that overwhelmed the enemy through sheer numbers. It was reliable, easy to repair, and could travel for miles without breaking down. On paper, it was a war winner, but in the fields of France, paper didn't matter. What mattered was the deep, resonant boom of a German 88mm cannon. And the Sherman's armor, just a few inches thick in most places, offered little protection against it. The tank's high profile made it an easy target, and its gasoline engine gave it a frightening tendency to erupt in flames when hit. The 5 men inside knew they were fighting in a machine that was good enough, but rarely the best. Did they feel like cogs in a giant machine, or did the bond between them make the risk feel manageable? Inside the turret, the world shrinks. The commander, perched in his seat, is the crew's only true connection to the outside, his head often poking out of the hatch to see the battlefield. Below him sits the gunner, a man who sees the war through a narrow periscope, a tiny rectangle of green fields and gray sky. And next to the gunner is the loader. His job is rhythm. His world is the heavy brass casing of a 75mm shell. He is the heartbeat of the tank's anger. Down in the hull sits the driver, staring through a narrow slit, his hands and feet extensions of the machine itself. And beside him, the bull gunner, firing a machine gun at targets he can barely see. 5 men, breathing the same air thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and fear. They operated not just as a team, but as a single organism, each man a vital organ. If one failed, they all failed. The sounds inside were a language all their own. The constant, deep rumble of the engine vibrated through the floor plates, a feeling you felt in your bones more than you heard with your ears. The squeal and clatter of the steel tracks was a constant companion, a sound that announced your arrival to the entire world. And then there was the hydraulic whir of the turret, a low hum as the gunner traversed, hunting for a target. The loudest sound, however, was the one that came from their own gun, the violent, deafening crack of a 75mm shell leaving the breech, a blast that filled the small space with a wave of pressure and the acrid smell of burnt powder. It was a sound of survival. But there was another sound they all dreaded, a sharp, metallic clang from the outside, the sound of an enemy shell finding its mark. After that clang, there was only a moment, a single, held breath to see what came next. Life inside the Sherman was built on trust. You had to trust that the driver wouldn't steer you into a ditch. You had to trust that the gunner would hit what he was aiming at. And everyone had to trust that the loader would be ready with the next round, because the seconds between shots were an eternity. The Germans had a word for it: finger Spitzengefühl, a fingertip feeling, an intuition for the flow of battle. American crews had to develop their own version, a silent understanding that passed between them with a glance or a nod. They learned each other's habits, the way one man chewed his lip when nervous, the way another hummed quietly under his breath. These weren't just fellow soldiers. They were the only 4 other people on the planet who understood what this life was like. One of the strangest things about this metal world was the food. Tank crews were often issued the same rations as infantry, but they found creative ways to use their machine. They would often brew coffee by filling a canteen cup with the water and grounds, then placing it on the hot engine manifold to heat up. Some crews even claimed they could cook eggs or fry bacon on a well-placed shovel head resting on the exhaust. It was a small act of domesticity in a world of pure chaos, a way to make the cold, impersonal machine feel a little more like home. But these small comforts couldn't erase the fundamental truth of their existence. They were a target, and the enemy's guns were bigger. This raises a question that history books rarely answer. We know the statistics, the armor thickness, the muzzle velocity of the guns, but we don't know the feeling. What was the true psychological toll of fighting a war from inside a machine nicknamed for a disposable lighter? Did the crews become fatalistic, accepting that their odds were poor? Or did the gallows humor and the intense bond of brotherhood create a strange kind of hope? A belief that their tank, their crew, would be the one to make it through. This unwritten history, the story of the human heart inside the steel beast, is where our story truly begins. It begins with a young man from Ohio who was about to face this reality for the first time. That young man was Private First Class Henry Wallace, and he was not a soldier by nature. Before the war, his world was the cool, greasy dark of an auto shop in Ohio. His hands, which were now expected to handle explosive shells, were accustomed to the precise language of tools, the specific turn of a wrench, the delicate feel of a spark plugs threading. He was a mechanic, a man who understood systems, who saw the world as a collection of parts that were meant to work together smoothly. And now, he was the newest, most untested part in the complex machine of a Sherman tank crew. He was a replacement. In the language of the front lines, a rebel. This was a lonely title to carry. He had been dropped into a family that had been forged by fire, a group of men who had already lost friends, maybe even the very man he was replacing. They didn't know him. They didn't know if they could trust him. And in the claustrophobic world of a tank, trust was more vital than armor. Every time he fumbled, every time he was a fraction of a second too slow, he could feel their eyes on him. Were they judging his nerve, or just quietly calculating their own odds of survival with him on the team? Adding to this pressure was a simple, unchangeable fact of his own body. Henry Wallace was left-handed. The world, and especially the United States military, was built for the right-handed man. The loader's position in a Sherman was a perfect example. The shells were stored to the loader's right. The breech of the 75mm cannon opened to his left. The standard procedure, drilled into him for hundreds of hours at Fort Knox, was a fluid, right-handed dance. You would pivot to your right, grab the 20-pound shell with your right hand, cradling its weight with your left. Then you would pivot back, face the breech, and ram the shell home with a powerful forward thrust. It was a motion designed to be efficient, repeatable, and safe. But for Henry, every part of it felt wrong. When he turned to grab a shell, his body felt twisted and off balance. As he turned back toward the gun, his left elbow would inevitably jam into the gunner's shoulder, a sharp, unwelcome intrusion in a space where inches mattered. The shell itself felt awkward in his grasp, its weight unnatural. The fluid dance taught at Fort Knox became a clumsy, stuttering sequence of movements inside the rocking, vibrating turret. The smooth rhythm he was supposed to provide was broken before it even began. Did he resent the machine for not fitting him, or did he resent himself for not fitting the machine? This was the great, terrifying gap between training and reality. Back in Kentucky, the ground was stable. The tank was stationary. An instructor with a stopwatch would bark out times, and the only consequence for being slow was another repetition. Here, in France, the ground was a sea of mud. The tank lurched and swayed. And the consequence for being slow. It didn't bear thinking about. The muscle memory he had worked so hard to build was failing him, because the context was completely different. The clean, predictable world of the training yard had been replaced by the violent, unpredictable physics of a real battlefield. He was a mechanic. He knew when a machine wasn't working right. And in this case, the machine was his own body, forced to follow a blueprint that didn't match its design. He could feel the inefficiency in his bones, the wasted motion, the awkward angles, the flicker of hesitation as his brain fought his body's natural instincts. He saw it as a problem to be solved, just like a misfiring engine or a faulty transmission. But you can't take a wrench to your own reflexes. You can't simply rewire your own nerves. All he could do was practice, hoping that sheer repetition would overcome his body's own logic. There is a little-known piece of military lore from that time. Some veteran crews had their own rituals for breaking in a new replacement. Some would ignore him completely for the first few days, a silent trial period to see if he would break under the pressure. Others would pepper him with questions, testing his knowledge, his nerve, his story. A new man was a disruption to the crew's delicate ecosystem. He changed the rhythm, the chemistry, the odds. The other 4 men in Henry's tank had likely been together for months, and the loss of their previous loader was a ghost that still sat in the turret with them. How does a quiet, left-handed mechanic from Ohio earn a place in a circle like that? Perhaps it was his quiet nature that helped. He wasn't loud or boastful. He was a watcher, a listener. A man who understood that you learn more by observing than by talking. He watched the gunner's hands, the commander's eyes, the driver's subtle shifts in posture. He was trying to learn the rhythm of the crew, even as he struggled to find his own. And so, he tried to force it. He tried to be faster, to mimic the right-handed motions he'd been taught, pushing through the awkwardness. But the harder he tried, the more he seemed to fumble. And he knew, with the cold certainty of a good mechanic, that a system under this much strain was bound to fail at the worst possible moment. The question that lingered in the air, unspoken but felt by everyone, was a simple one. What would happen when the clock was no longer a stopwatch, but an incoming shell? The system strained, and then, on a misty September morning somewhere near the city of Nancy, it broke. The day began like any other. A gray, damp light filtered through the trees, the ground soft and churned from recent rain. The tank moved cautiously, part of a larger advance, its engine a low growl in the quiet countryside. Inside, the 5 men were in their familiar state of heightened awareness, their senses tuned to the slightest change in the landscape. There was a strange intimacy to these moments of calm before the storm, a shared silence where every man was alone with his own thoughts, yet deeply connected to the others. Then, the world shattered. It was the commander's voice, sharp and urgent over the intercom. "Contact, 11 o'clock, tanks!" The turret jolted as the gunner swung it left, the hydraulic whine rising to a shriek. Through his narrow periscope, the gunner saw them, 3 dark shapes emerging from the fog across an open field. German Panthers. Their long cannons and sloped armor were unmistakable, and they were already turning their guns toward them. The range was closing fast. The commander's voice cut through the noise again, a string of numbers. Range, 800. On the lead tank. Fire. This was the moment. The instant where all the training, all the drills, all the quiet fear was supposed to coalesce into perfect mechanical action. The gunner laid his crosshairs on the target. In the belly of the tank, the driver eased off the throttle, steadying the platform. And in the turret, all eyes, seen and unseen, were on Henry Wallace. He moved, just as he had been taught. He pivoted right, his hands reaching for the familiar shape of a shell. But the tank was not a stationary training platform at Fort Knox. It was rocking gently, a beast trying to settle on uneven ground. The shell, all 20 pounds of it, felt slick with condensation in his hands. He turned back toward the cannon breech. And it happened, just as he feared it would. In the tight confines, his left elbow slammed hard into the gunner's back. The jolt was enough to break his concentration. The heavy shell tipped in his grip. For a terrifying split second, he was sure he was going to drop it. He froze. A cascade of failures locked his body in place. The rhythm was gone. The world had stopped. An entire second, an eternity in a tank duel, was lost. "Loader, what are you doing? Load!" The commander's voice was no longer a command, it was a plea. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over Henry. He knew he was too slow. He knew the standard way wasn't working. In that moment, the rule book, the training, the hundreds of hours of repetition, it all evaporated. His mechanic's mind, the part of him that understood broken systems, took over. But it wasn't his mind that moved first. It was his body. In a single, fluid motion born of pure instinct, he gave up. He stopped trying to follow the rules. He turned his back completely to the gun, a move that would have earned him a screaming reprimand from any instructor. He was now facing the rear of the turret. He couldn't see the breach. He couldn't see anything. But he didn't need to. He reached behind him with his left hand, his natural hand. His fingers found the cold, familiar steel of the open breech. It was a blind trust, the kind a mechanic has when reaching into the guts of an engine for a bolt he cannot see. His other hand brought the shell back. He guided the base of the round into the chamber by feel alone. Then, using the power of his entire back and shoulder, he slammed it home. The breech block snapped shut with a satisfying, metallic thud. The gun fired. The recoil punched the air in the turret. The roar was deafening. But through the smoke and the ringing in his ears, Henry was already moving. He did it again. Turn, reach back, guide, slam. The motion was strange, unorthodox, and utterly backwards. But it was fast. It was smooth. It was a rhythm that his body understood. A second shell went in. The gun fired again. Then a third. Silence. The only sound was the high-pitched whine in their ears and the low rumble of the engine. The crew held its breath. The commander's voice, when it came over the intercom, was quiet, laced with disbelief. "Targets neutralized. All targets neutralized." For a long moment, nobody in the turret moved. The gunner slowly turned his head, his eyes wide. He looked at Henry, who was still half-turned, his hand resting on another shell. He finally spoke, his voice raspy. How did you do that so fast?" Henry didn't have an answer. He barely understood it himself. It was a desperate gamble, a physical argument against a system that had been designed to fail him. But it worked. The question that remains, a question that perhaps Henry himself could never answer, is what truly happened in that moment of crisis. Was it a conscious decision, a flash of mechanical genius under fire? Or was it something deeper, a subconscious rebellion of muscle and nerve, the desperate, unthinking act of a body trying to survive? The answer lies somewhere in those 3 seconds of instinct, in the space between panic and perfection. The heat of the battle faded, replaced by a strange, contemplative quiet inside the turret. The adrenaline drained away, leaving the crew with the metallic taste of burnt powder and a profound sense of curiosity. The immediate danger was gone, but the mystery of what had just happened lingered in the cramped space. They had all felt it, the sudden shift in rhythm, the impossible speed. It was as if their tank had found a new gear, one they never knew it had. The gunner's question hung in the air. How did you do that so fast? That evening, long after the engines had cooled and the threat of enemy fire had receded, the crew of the Sherman became a team of scientists. Their laboratory was the muddy ground behind their tank. Their instrument was a standard-issue stopwatch held in the commander's steady hand. The experiment was simple. They would test the old way against the new. First, Henry performed the maneuver exactly as they had been taught at Fort Knox, the right-handed pivot, the face-forward insertion. The commander clicked the watch. 4.6 seconds, he announced. They tried it again, 4.7, and again, 4.5. The numbers were consistent, solid, and by the book. They were also, as they now knew, dangerously slow. Then came the moment of truth. "All right, Henry," the commander said. Show us your way." Henry took a breath, turned his back to the imaginary breach, and replicated the blind, backward motion he had discovered in the heat of combat. The movements were fluid, almost graceful, a stark contrast to the clunky, forced motions from before. Click. The commander stared at the stopwatch, then stared at Henry. He cleared his throat. 2.9 seconds. A full second and a half had been shaved off. It was an eternity. They ran the test again. 2.8, and a third time. 3 seconds flat. It wasn't a fluke. It was a revolution, contained in a single, unorthodox movement. The other 4 men looked at each other, a silent wave of understanding passing between them. This wasn't just a party trick. This was a tactical advantage. A faster loader meant a faster gun. A faster gun meant that in a duel with a German Panther or Tiger, they could get 2 shots off in the time it used to take to get one. It was the difference between suppressing an enemy and destroying one. It was the difference between living and dying. Henry, the quiet replacement, the awkward left-handed mechanic, had just rewritten the rules of their survival. Word of the backward loader began to spread, not through official channels but through the informal network that connects soldiers on the front line. It was a whisper in the chow line, a murmur during a maintenance break. Other loaders, intrigued and skeptical, would wander over to Henry's tank. They'd watch him demonstrate the technique behind the motor pool, a strange, counterintuitive dance. Some would laugh at first, shaking their heads at the sheer wrongness of turning your back on the gun. But then they would try it themselves, and the laughter would stop, replaced by the quiet clicking of stopwatches and low whistles of disbelief. Within days, the whispers reached the ears of Major Creighton Abrams, the commander of the 37th Tank Battalion. Abrams was a force of nature, a tanker's tanker known for his aggressive tactics and his deep personal investment in the lives of his men. He was not a man who cared for rigid doctrine when it conflicted with battlefield reality. When he heard rumors of a loader who could fire almost twice as fast as the manual said was possible, he didn't dismiss it. He went to see for himself. He found Henry's crew during a drill exercise and ordered them to halt. The major, a man whose presence commanded immediate respect, climbed onto the tank and addressed the young private. "Wallace, they tell me you found a new way to do things. Show me." In the intimidating presence of the battalion commander, Henry demonstrated his technique. Abrams watched, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. He timed it himself. Then he had Henry do it again and again. The results were undeniable. There was no committee meeting. There was no request for a study sent back to headquarters. Abrams understood the brutal calculus of armored warfare. He knew that seconds were measured in lives. He turned to the crew and then to the other officers who had gathered to watch. He gave a simple, direct order that would echo through the battalion. "If it keeps you alive," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the engines, "it's standard practice, starting today." It was a remarkable moment of leadership. Abrams had the wisdom to recognize that true innovation doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it comes from the mud-stained boots of a private first class who was simply trying to solve a problem. But this raises an interesting question about the nature of military command. What if Henry's commander had been a different sort of man, one more concerned with regulations than results? Could this small, life-saving innovation have been squashed by bureaucracy, dismissed as an unauthorized and dangerous deviation from protocol? The story of the backward loader isn't just a story about ingenuity. It's also a story about a leader who was wise enough to see it and brave enough to champion it. Major Abrams' order was the spark, but the fire that spread through the 37th Tank Battalion was carried by the men themselves. An official command can change a procedure, but it cannot by itself change a culture. The real adoption of Henry's technique happened in the quiet moments between battles, in the greasy, mud-caked world of the motor pool. It became a piece of unwritten scripture, passed from one loader to another, not in a classroom, but in the shadow of a silent tank. Veteran loaders, men with months of combat experience, became the new instructors. They would gather the younger replacements, the green kids fresh from the States, and tell them to forget for a moment what they had learned at Fort Knox. "Watch this," they'd say, and then demonstrate the strange backward motion. At first, it looked clumsy, even comical, but then the stopwatch would come out and the numbers would do the talking. The lesson was simple and potent. The official way is how you pass inspection, but this new way is how you stay alive. This kind of soldier-led innovation was a quiet but constant theme of the Second World War. The GI was a master of improvisation. You would see it everywhere if you knew where to look. Infantrymen would weld steel plates to the front of their jeeps for protection. Medics would rig their bags with custom straps and pouches for faster access, and tankers most famously would pile sandbags on the front of their Shermans or weld on extra tracks and scrap metal, creating makeshift armor against German anti-tank weapons. It was a practice officially discouraged by command, who worried about the extra weight straining the engine, but the crews did it anyway. They were writing their own survival manual, one chapter at a time, based on the brutal lessons of the battlefield. Henry's loading technique was another chapter in that book. The process of learning the new method was a physical conversation. A veteran would stand behind a rookie, guiding his hands, teaching him how to find the breach by feel. "Don't think about it so much," they'd advise. "Let your hands do the work. Your body knows where it is." It was a lesson in trusting your instincts over your training, a difficult thing for a soldier to learn. But as they practiced, the awkwardness would melt away, replaced by a smooth, powerful rhythm. The men weren't just learning a new technique. They were learning a new kind of confidence. They were taking control of their machine in a way they never had before. Inside the turret, the change was palpable. Engagements became smoother, more coordinated. The frantic, desperate feeling that could creep in during a firefight was replaced by a sense of calm efficiency. The gunner would call for a round, and before he could finish the sentence, the clank of the breech closing would tell him it was ready. It created a powerful, symbiotic rhythm between the gunner and the loader. the two men working as one. This newfound speed rippled outward, affecting the entire crew. The commander could be more aggressive, knowing his gun could speak faster. The driver could hold his position with more certainty, knowing they wouldn't be a sitting target for long. The tank itself felt more dangerous, more alive. Interestingly, many crews developed their own unique shorthand to manage their work inside the turret. They would often use chalk to write directly on the metal walls, keeping a running tally of what kind of ammunition was being used. A simple code of AP for armor-piercing or HE for high explosive. It was a quick, visual reference in a chaotic environment. One can imagine a loader, after adopting Henry's technique, adding a new personal mark, a small X or a check mark, to signal his own readiness, another small entry in the unwritten rulebook of his crew. These were the secret languages and rituals that turned a collection of soldiers into a single, cohesive fighting unit. Henry Wallace himself faded into the background of his own revolution. He was never put on a stage or made an official instructor. He was simply the source, the patient zero of a powerful idea. He would quietly help those who asked. But his satisfaction seemed to come not from recognition, but from seeing his idea take root and knowing it was making a difference. He was a mechanic, after all. He had fixed a broken system, and now he was content to watch it run smoothly. But this raises a profound and ultimately unanswerable question. How many other innovations like this were there? How many life-saving tricks, brilliant battlefield hacks, and ingenious survival strategies were born in a moment of crisis, passed between a handful of soldiers, and then vanished forever when those men went home or didn't come home at all? History is written from the top down, from the reports of generals and the plans of strategists. But the ground truth of war is often a tapestry of these small, unrecorded acts of genius. The story of Henry Wallace survived by a thread, a whisper that was loud enough to be heard by the right person. How many others were lost to the wind? The stories of war are fragile things, written on the wind. For every tale of heroism that makes it into the history books, 1,000 moments of quiet genius like Henry Wallace's simply fade away. But Henry's story was different. While the man himself would soon vanish from the record, his idea had become something powerful. It had become muscle memory. And muscle memory is a story the body never forgets. When the war in Europe finally ended in the spring of 1945, a wave of relief washed over the continent. For the men of the 37th Tank Battalion, it was the end of a long, brutal road. They had survived. Now, all they wanted was to go home. The vast, complex machinery of the U.S. Army shifted from fighting a war to the even more complex task of sending millions of soldiers back to their former lives. In this great dispersal, stories, names, and the origins of ideas were easily lost. No one was taking notes for the history books. They were just trying to catch the next train back to a life they had left behind. And so, Henry Wallace went home. He returned to Ohio, to a world that smelled of cut grass and gasoline, not diesel and burnt powder. He took off his uniform, and with it, he seemed to put away the man he had been forced to become. He went back to fixing engines, his hands once again finding their purpose in the familiar logic of civilian machines. He married, raised a family, and lived a quiet, unassuming life. Like so many of his generation, he didn't talk about the war. It wasn't a secret, but a private history, a chapter he had closed. Perhaps the memories were too heavy, or perhaps he simply believed that what happened over there had no place in the peaceful world he was trying to build back home. But as Henry was settling into his quiet life, his innovation was just beginning its own journey. The technique, the backward motion, was too effective to disappear. The new soldiers who arrived in the final months of the war learned it not from a manual, but from the veterans who had perfected it under fire. When these seasoned tankers returned to the United States, many became instructors themselves. At training grounds like Fort Knox, they were tasked with preparing a new generation of soldiers for a new and uncertain world, and they taught what they knew worked. The official training manual might have said one thing, but a sergeant who had survived the hedgerows of Normandy would tell his recruits, "Now, let me show you how we really did it." Enjoying this journey into the past? Consider subscribing so you won't miss the next story we uncover together. By the time the Korean War broke out just 5 years later, the technique was no longer an unofficial trick. It, or a refined version of it, had been absorbed into the official doctrine. The origins were murky, attributed simply to lessons learned during Sawi-Fu. The name Henry Wallace was never mentioned. The technique had become an orphan, a piece of battlefield wisdom whose parentage was unknown. Young loaders in new tanks like the M26 Pershing and the M46 Patton were now taught a method of speed and efficiency that owed its existence to a left-handed mechanic in a Sherman. The innovation had achieved a kind of immortality, but its creator had become a ghost. For a time, a whisper of his name may have survived. It's a common quirk of military culture for a technique or a piece of gear to be nicknamed after its creator. For a few years after the war, perhaps a handful of instructors, veterans of the 37th, might have referred to it as the Wallace grip or the Wallace shuffle. It would have been a small nod, a piece of oral history shared between men who knew the real story. But as those men retired or moved on, the name would have faded, leaving only the motion behind. The man became a myth, and then the myth was forgotten, leaving only the truth of a better way to do the job. This leads to the final lingering question of Henry's story. Why was his contribution so completely forgotten by the institution that adopted it? There is no single, simple answer. Part of it was surely Henry's own quiet humility. He never sought a medal or a commendation. He was a mechanic who solved a mechanical problem, and for him, that was enough. Part of it was the impersonal nature of the military itself, an enormous organization that absorbs data and best practices without necessarily preserving the human stories behind them. And part of it was simply the overwhelming scale of the war, a global conflict so vast that the story of one private and his clever idea was a single grain of sand on an endless beach. Today, if you visit the museum at Fort Knox, you can stand inside the turret of a restored M4 Sherman. The first thing you notice is how impossibly small it is. You stand where the loader stood, and you can feel the cold steel that was his world. In that cramped space, Henry Wallace's innovation feels less like a stroke of genius and more like an act of profound and desperate logic. He didn't turn his back on the gun to break the rules. He turned his back to survive them. His name is not on any plaque, but his legacy is there in the silent, elegant solution he gifted to the men who came after him. The story of Henry Wallace is, in the end, not just about a single soldier or a single tank. It's about a timeless and universal truth, that the grand sweep of history is often shaped by small, unrecorded acts of human ingenuity. We tend to think of innovation as something that happens in laboratories or in the minds of famous generals. We see history as a series of big decisions and dramatic battles. But so much of it is written in the margins by ordinary people who, when faced with a problem, simply refused to accept that it couldn't be solved. Henry was a mechanic placed in a situation where the machine he was asked to operate was fundamentally at odds with his own body. Instead of breaking, he adapted. He found a better way, not for glory or recognition, but for survival. And in doing so, he gifted that survival to countless others, men who would never know his name, but who would owe their lives to the rhythm he discovered in a moment of terror. His story is a quiet reminder that progress doesn't always announce itself with a trumpet. Sometimes it's a whisper in a motor pool, a shared secret between soldiers, a piece of wisdom passed down until it becomes common knowledge. It reminds us that every system, every rule, and every machine is ultimately operated by a human being. And within that human being lies a capacity for creativity and resilience that can never be fully captured in an official manual. The greatest legacies are not always the ones carved in stone, but the ones woven into the fabric of how things are done, living on as silent, anonymous, and essential truths. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this story left you thinking, we hope you'll join us again for our next journey into the past.